Blacks carry Eurasian DNA because the first Eurasians were blacks, Kushites. When some blacks take DNA ancestry tests, the results indicate that they carry Eurasian ancestry. Afro-Americans accept this discovery as evidence of white plantation owners raping their great-grandmothers. This is a convenient answer for Afro-Americans, but it appears that Africans, whose ancestors have never mated with Europeans, also discovered that their genetic ancestry tests denote the presence of Eurasian ancestry. I viewed the video by the Fulani gentleman named Said. He was married to a Jamaican girl named Sophia. This couple posted their video under the title of Sophia and Said. In the video, Said reviewed his DNA results. After Said discussed his African ancestry, he mentioned that they found Eurasian admixture from his ancestry DNA test, and he wondered how this could be true. He did not understand this finding because he was a member of the Fulani people, an African tribe that lives in West Africa. This result was shocking because Said's family had never mixed with Eurasians. This begs the question, why does Said carry Eurasian ancestry when his ancestors never mated with Europeans? The answer is simple. The Eurasian genes carried by Africans and Afro-Americans are in reality African genes that were carried by Africans, mainly Kushites, who settled Anatolia and later migrated to Europe. After viewing Said and Sophia's video, I contacted Said and explained that a study of ancient history indicates that many of the first Europeans that came from Anatolia were Kushites, and that they were Niger-Congo speakers, and they left genetic evidence of their presence. I explained that the so-called Eurasian aspects of Said's DNA tests represent the genes left by these Kushites that experts have erroneously labeled Eurasian. Said and his Sophia, his wife, were happy to learn these facts. Around 800 BC, the Greek poet Homer mentions the Ethiopians, or Kushites, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer, the Greek poet, said that the Kushites were the most just of men, the favorites of the gods. Many Kushites who later ruled Egypt during the 15th Egyptian dynasty were Kushites from Anatolia. Today, Anatolia includes modern Syria and Turkey. Like Egypt, Anatolia, now Turkey has abundant artifacts and other materials which show without a doubt the blackness of its people. To the Greeks and Romans, there were two Kush Empires, one in Africa and the other in Asia. Homer alluded to the two Kushite empires when he wrote an Odyssey, 1:23. A race divided whom the sloping rays, the rising and setting sun surveys. In the Iliad 1:4-23, Homer wrote that the god Zeus went to Kush to banquet with the blameless Ethiopians. In 64 BC, Strabo, the Greek geographer and historian, in chapter 1 of his geography, stated that there were two Kush empires, one in Asia, the other in Africa. Strabo claimed in addition to Kush in Nubia and Upper Egypt, some previous Greco-Roman authors considered southern Phoenicia up to Mount Amanus in Syria as Kush. The original homeland of the Kushites, or Niger-Congo speakers, was probably situated in the Saharan highlands during the Unanian period. This is why the Egyptians often referred to the Kushites as a hill people. This is supported by the various meanings of Gardner's Egyptian sign N25. The N25 sign from Gardner's list of Egyptian signs, Kash, or Kash, meant Kush. From here, the Kushite populations migrated into the Fezzan, Nile Valley, and Sudan, as their original homeland became more and more arid. The Nitro-Congo speakers formerly lived in the highland regions of the Fezzan and Hogar until after 4000 BC. Originally hunter-gatherers, the Proto-Niger-Congo people developed an agro-pastoral economy, which included the cultivation of millet and domestication of cattle and sheep. This is part of the ancient homeland of the Dravidians, some ancient Egyptians, Sumerians, Niger-Chaldephonian, Mandi, and Elamite speakers. We call this part of Africa the Fertile African Crescent. We call these people Proto-Saharans. The generic term for this group in the ancient literature was Kushite. Origination of these diverse Kushite tribes in the ancient Sahara explains the analogy between the Bafsudroham languages, as outlined. These Proto-Saharans were called Wawat, Tasedi, Kash, Kesh, and Tehanu by the Egyptians. The Niger-Congo inhabitants of the Fezzan were round-headed Africans. The cultural characteristics of the Fezzanese were analogous to the C group culture itself, and people of Tasedi and Wawat. The C group people were the Proto-Saharan or Niger-Congo speakers, who occupied the Sudan and Fezzan region between 3700 and 1300 BC. The inhabitants of the Fezzan were called Tamahus. The Tamahus represented the Proto-Niger-Congo speakers. The Hemu were organized into two groups, the Tehanu in the north and the Nehesi in the south. A Tehanu personage is depicted on an Amrathian period pottery vessel. Some Tehanu wore a pointed beard and phalanx sheath and feathers on their heads. The Tehamus were called the C group people by archaeologists. The central Fezzan was the center of C group settlement. Quillac discussed in detail the presence of C group culture traits in the central Fezzan, along with their cattle during the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. The Kushites lived in Tasedi and Wawat. Europeans, when they first translated the Egyptian language, referred to Kush as Negro land. The first mention of Kush in Egyptian texts is by Winnie, an Egyptian administrator. Below is the Winnie text. In the Winnie text, Wawat king was called Hekakashut. Hekakashut today is translated as kings of foreign lands or foreign kings. When Europeans originally translated Winnie's inscription using the Gardner Egyptian word list, the original meaning of Kesh was king's Negro land. This interpretation of Kash and Kesh was a Eurocentric interpretation of N25 because there was no such thing, there was no place called Negro land, so the actual meaning was kings of Kash or Kesh. The term Heke Kash, because it related to Wawat rulers, have been translated as rulers of Negro land. The Egyptian element Ut were added to Kash to make it plural and denote nationality. The Winnie inscription makes it clear that the name Kash was made up of 3 N25 signs from Gardner's list of Egyptian signs. The N25 sign also represents Kash equal Kush. This meant that N25 represented the name Kash and Kash for the ethnonym Kushite. During the 5th dynasty of Egypt, 2563 to 2423 BC, mainly during the reign of Sahure, there is mention of the Tehanu people. Sahure referred to the Tehanu leader as Hatti Tehanu. These Hatti may correspond to the Hatti-speaking people of Anatolia. The Hatti people often refer to themselves as Kashkas or Kaskas. The Abusir mummies recently found in Egypt show that many of the genes carried by Eurasians were already being carried by ancient Africans in Egypt. The problem with coconuts, Negroes, people who are brown on the outside but white inside, is that they don't understand how to analyze data and form a conclusion. As a result, when they read a paper, they accept what is written at face value, without looking critically at the data and making their own interpretation. First of all, Afro-American scholars have accepted that the Egyptians were black African people for the past 200 years. These black scholars include Carter G. Woodson, W. Du Bois, and J. Rogers, and the Senegalese scholar Anta Diop. But Negro apologists like Gates, Kettles, and etc. spend their time parroting the status quo line that the Egyptians were a mixed race. The same group attempt to make it appear that the Fulani, Somalis, and Ethiopians are black-skinned whites because of their facial features. This is stupid, because man originated in Africa, so the physical features of these populations are African features. In the article by Schoenemann et al., 2017, on the Abashir mummies, it is basically a discussion of data that support Greco-Roman origins for Egypt, but the data on the mummies dating between 992 to 749 BC can offer us keen insight into haplogroups carried by Egyptians during this time. The genomic data from this period is important because the people of Abusir at this time would have been primarily Egyptians. As a result, the mtDNA carried by the Egyptians confirms the reality that the so-called Eurasian haplogroups are nothing more than African haplogroups. In Schoenemann et al. 2017, there were 100 mummies in the study. A total of 27 mummies were dated between 992 to 749 BC. In this figure, you can see the class carried by these Egyptians. Below are the frequencies of the haplogroups among Egyptians at this time. The haplogroup frequency in the Abusir mummies is quite interesting. The frequency of genes labeled Eurasian today were U 18.5, T haplogroup 22.2, J haplogroup 18.5, X haplogroup 675 10,000s, M1A 06.75, haplogroup H 06.75, haplogroup I 0.0675, haplogroup HV 0.037, haplogroup RO 0.037, haplogroup K 0.037, and haplogroup N 0.037. The presence of these haplogroups among the Abusir population show that the U, T, and J class had a high frequency among the Egyptians, and that many of the so-called Middle East clans were already present in Egypt before the Greco-Romans, Turks, and etc. ruled Egypt. Yes, these clans that are classed today as Eurasian haplogroups are in reality haplogroups that were carried by Africans. The Abusir article provides more data on the African origin of Eurasian mtDNA. Many of the people who lived in Anatolia, and one of the major names for the black people there were Hatti. The Hatti were probably members of the Tehenu tribes. The Tehenu was composed of various ethnic groups. One of the Tehenu tribes was identified by the Egyptians as the Hattu or Haltu. The Hatti people may be related to the Hattu, one of the Delta Tehenu tribes. Many archaeologists believe that the Tehenu people were related to Sea-Group people. The Hatti language is closely related to African and Dravidian languages. The Hatti controlled the city-state of Kusara. Kusara was situated in southern Anatolia. Singer, an archaeologist historian of Mesopotamia, has suggested that the Kaska are remnants of the indigenous Hattian population, which was forced northward by the Hittites. But at least as late as 1800 BC, Anatolia was basically settled by Hattians. The Hattians forced from southern Anatolia were among the Hyksos who conquered the delta. The Hyksos ruled Egypt from 1650 to 1550. The New Kingdom lasted from 1549 to 1292. During the New Kingdom, Egyptians used the name Amr as a generic name for the Asians. The term Habiru was an ethnonym for one of the Asian tribes. But the Hyksos, they weren't called Habiru. they weren't called they were called Kus. They were called Kus because the Hyksos were Egyptians who had formerly been the Kushites. During the 5th dynasty of Egypt, 2563 to 2423 BC, namely during the reign of Sahuri, there is mention of the Tehanu people. Sahuri referred to the Tehanu leader as Hatti Tehanu. These Hatti correspond to the Hatti-speaking people of Anatolia. The Hatti Hurrian people often refer to themselves as Kashkas or Kaskas. The black Europeans entered Europe from 2 directions, Iberia and the steppes. The black Europeans in the steppes came from Anatolia. They took the R1 haplogroup into Europe. The African Sahara in Morocco was a major source of the bell beaker and corded-ware cultural complex. The proto-bell beaker pottery dates back to 4,500 BC in the Sahara. When these people talk about the ancient Europeans, they always bring up the bell beaker people. These bell beaker people were not ancient Europeans. Yes, they lived in Europe, but they originally had come from Africa. Agro-pastoral people cultivated crops and herded cattle. Elements of the agro-pastoral members of the bell beaker and corded-ware complexes appear first in the African Sahara. Here we see rock engravings of cattle herders and hunters using similar bows and arrows. The Yamnaya archers' rich guard and bows may have had their origin in Sahara, where we see similar rest guards. Dugas, one of the important archaeologists that have studied the bell beaker culture in Africa, provides a number of radiocarbon dates for bell beaker complex in North Africa. We find that the bell beaker ware dates to 3700 BC in Morocco. By 2700 BC, we see the expansion of the beaker complex into Iberia. The Iberian bell beaker complex is associated with what's called the maritime tradition. There are numerous bell beaker sites in the Sahara and Morocco. A center of the Moroccan beaker complex, ceramics and arrowheads, come from Hasi Quenjka in the cave of Ifri-Obeid. Artifacts found at these sites are similar to Iberian beaker complex ware. The interesting fact about the discovery of these artifacts is that they were widespread across the Middle Atlas mountains at sites such as El Kifim, Skhirat, Derozwa, Kaf, and Plat El Gir, and Ifri Wat. Thomas Kivisild and Matheson et al. Provided a detailed discussion of R1 in prehistoric Europe. One of the most interesting findings was the presence of V88 in ancient Europe. It is also interesting to note that the European agro-pastoral populations associated with bell beaker and Yamnaya carried the genomes associated with Africans recorded in 2010 as illustrated in Figure 1 in Table 2. The earliest R1 individuals come from Samara, dating back 7,000 years ago. This Samaran individual was an African. He carried R1B1. Tarak argues that the maritime tradition of the beaker culture style of copos, site on the river Tajo in Portugal, originated in Morocco. This beaker-decorated pottery is found in the cemeteries of Al-Kahfi. From Iberia, the beaker tradition migrated to the Lower Rhine, where it evolved into the corded-ware beakers. The estimated age of R1B M343 is over 20,000 years ago. R1A420 and R1343 probably date to around 25,000 years ago. The oldest R1B M343 clad found among ancient Europeans dates to 14,000 years ago. These lineages belonging to R1 include the 14,000-year-old Vellabruna man from Italy and the 7,000-year-old individual from Spain. We find that the earliest offshoot of R1B M343 variation is the V88 subclad of Africa. Yes, the V88 subclad. This subclad has the highest frequency among African populations. Early Neolithic relatives to the subclad V88 samples have been found across Europe from Iberia to Germany and then Samara. These relatives are usually recorded by geneticists as R1. Thomas Kivisild and Matheson et al. Provided a detailed discussion of R1 in prehistoric Europe. One of the most interesting findings was the presence of V88 in ancient Europe. It is also interesting to note that the European agro-pastoral populations associated with Bell Beaker and Yamnaya carried the genomes associated with Africans recorded in 2010 as illustrated in Figure 1 in Table 2. The earliest R1 individuals come from Samara, dating back 7,000 years ago. This Samaran individual was an African. He carried R1B1. Tarak argues that the maritime tradition of the Beaker culture style of copos, site on the river Tajo in Portugal, originated in Morocco. This Beaker-decorated pottery is found in the cemeteries of Al-Kahfi. From Iberia, the Beaker tradition migrated to the Lower Rhine, where it evolved into the corded ware beakers. The estimated age of R1b M343 is over 20,000 years ago. R1A420 and R1343 probably date to around 25,000 years ago. The oldest R1b M343 clad found among ancient Europeans dates to 14,000 years ago. These lineages belonging to R1 include the 14,000-year-old Vellabruna man from Italy and the 7,000-year-old individual from Spain. We find that the earliest offshoot of R1b M343 variation is the V88 subclad of Africa. Yes, the V88 subclad. This subclad has the highest frequency among African populations. Early Neolithic relatives to the subclad V88 samples have been found across Europe from Iberia to Germany and then Samara. These relatives are usually recorded by geneticists as R1B1 or R1B1A, but they usually revolve around R1B1. Kivisild et al. Makes it clear that the V88 subclads had relatives in early Neolithic samples from across a wide geographical area from Iberia and Germany to Samara. These are namely R1B1, RL278. This would place carriers of R1 haplogroups related to V88 among the Yamnaya and Bell Beaker people. Given the wide distribution of M269 in Africa, the carrier of this haplogroup into Europe were probably also Africans, since the Bell Beaker people culture originated in Morocco and not in Europe. The recent most common ancestor of R1 M173 in Europe is 5,000-year-old. The R1 M173 samples from Central and Western Europe were usually R1b L11, R1A1 Z283, and R1A M417 without Z645. In relation to the eastern samples from Yamnaya culture and Samara belong to the R1B11, Z2105, and R1B1 RL278, and R1A Z93 subclads. All of these different mtDNA haplogroups are haplogroups that were carried by Africans or Dravidians. R1 M269 became one of the major European genomes during the Bronze Age. Researchers believe the impetus for this migration from Anatolia into the steppes and across Europe belonged to the Yamnaya culture. And the Yanama culture, as I said earlier, was a culture that originated in Anatolia. The Beaker complex made a rapid expansion across Western Europe into Central Europe from Iberia. The Beaker Bell culture overlaps the corded ware complex. In fact, Inigo Hatti et al. Found that the Beaker people in their sample carried R1b S116 and P312. It was these Africans who left their genes in Europe. Genes which have been misidentified as Eurasian today because geneticists found them in ancient European skeletons and assumed they were white Europeans. But these skeletons were not skeletons of white Europeans. They were skeletons of blacks. The genes carried by the ancient Europeans were blacks. And in other words, those genes, when you discover them and your DNA profile says that you have Eurasian genes, those Eurasian genes come from the black people who formerly ruled ancient Europe and Anatolia.